Thank you for listening to this message from Northwest Hills Community Church in Corvallis, Oregon. You can learn more about our church at nwhills.com. Today, lead pastor Josh Carstensen continues a series on the life of David. David was called Israel's greatest king because he had a heart after God. We see a clear example after David is crowned king and establishes Jerusalem, the city of David. David desires to dwell in the house of the Lord, which at that time meant bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. But in doing that, David learned an important lesson about how God wants us to approach him. Also, as part of the Something to Say series, we'll start the message with someone's testimony. We hope you find it encouraging. Now, here's today's message.
Hello, my name is Sierra Coleman, and I have been going to Northwest Hills for just a little bit over a year. Following Jesus has changed my life in a lot of ways, really. Growing up, I grew up in a Mormon family and really felt like just that was checking a lot of boxes in terms of how I lived out my faith. Felt like it was very works-based and just, was always very worried about trying to earn my salvation and was I doing the right things? Was I, committing any key sins in my life? And that was totally my perspective. I remember probably being 12 years old one day and just sobbing in my bedroom because I knew that there was no way I could be perfect, and so I was going to hell, and I guess that was that. So as I got a little bit older, I kind of became a bit more inactive in the church. I believed in God. I didn't want to not have a relationship with him, but I wasn't super interested in going to church, and I kind of stopped doing some of those things. When I got to college, I had a really good friend. Just one night we were hanging out on the couch chatting, and they said, "Hey, what do you believe in?" And we had a really good conversation about that. From there, they invited me to church with them. I started hanging out with their friends. Noticed that their friends, they just loved Jesus, and they would talk about Jesus and God and just in their normal day-to-day life, and that was really profound for me. I could never imagine enjoying talking about Jesus or wanting to talk about that with people. I ended up being part of a campus ministry, and one day I was at that campus ministry. My friend walks up to me and says, "Hey, I've signed you up for one-on-one sessions with this pastor." I remember being kind of mad. I was like, "What? I didn't sign up for these sessions. Where are you signing me up for one-on-ones?" But it's amazing how God works in those ways, and ultimately it was in one of those one-on-ones with that pastor that I was saved. And then I married that best friend. So I think really a lot of it came down to just learning more about Jesus and who he was. I had never read the Bible. I read it for the first time actually with Northwest Hills last year. Just getting to go through all of the books was awesome, and just seeing who Jesus is and getting that fuller view. I think that's when things really shifted. When I was doing these one-on-one sessions with the pastor, I was reading in my Bible, I was going to church, just kind of taking it all in, really. So Jesus has really changed my life by just showing me who he is. That he is a God who loves me and wants my heart, and I think that's really just changed the way that I live completely. Before that I would have never pictured waking up in the morning and reading my Bible and praying, and most days really wanting to do those things. Before really having a relationship with Jesus, I never wanted to pursue Jesus in that way. And now I find myself wanting to read my Bible, signing up for Bible studies, praying, talking to my family and to Austin about God. God wants to know you, and so if you think that he just is looking for something specific out of you, I would just encourage you to really just pray and ask God to give you that desire to know who he truly is, and just figure out more about him, get in his word, and just get that better picture of who he is.
Sierra, thank you. Where are you? I know you walked in here. Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for making God not be just a relic that's out there, but a personal God who loves you deeply. That's a sweet story. Austin, good call with having your girlfriend meet with the pastor to confirm her salvation before marrying her. That was smooth. That was smooth. Welcome to church. If you have a Bible, let's go. We're going to be in 1 Chronicles 10 today. at the very end. And I just apologize up front if you've got a journal and you're following along, which I hope that you do. The reading from the journal says 2 Samuel 5. 2 Samuel 5 is a parallel passage to 1 Chronicles 11, but I'm just starting in the Chronicles, and we're going to jump back and forth between Samuel and Chronicles this morning. And I would also say, if you are trying to follow along with the life of David, I would encourage you this week, so if you're a note taker, write this down. This week, read 2 Samuel 1 through 10, and then 1 Chronicles 10 through 17. That will give you context for what we are studying in David's life. I should have done the work to put that in the journals 9 months ago when we planned this out. I am sorry, but that's what you get right now. So I will say it again, and it is also in the community group notes this week for those of you in community groups. So that would be 2 Samuel 1 through 10 and 1 Chronicles 10 through 17. That will catch you up to where we will be next week as we start the life of David. So there you go. So 1 Chronicles 10, if you are able, would you stand with us? We're just going to jump right into it today. Afterwards, I'll give you a little bit of context to why we're doing the things that we're doing right now. But let's go. 1 Chronicles 10, starting in verse 13. The verses should be up here. Yep. And follow along with me. Here we go. When I'm done, I'm going to say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you're going to say, "Thanks be to God." And I think it will just be all the more sweet as we finish our passage today and just recognizing God's holiness and how sweet it is that we have a piece of him. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. This is interesting. Listen to this. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. 11 verse 1. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. And David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, where Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. And the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, "You will not come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. David said, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." And Joab, the son of Jeriah, went up first, so he became chief. And David lived in the stronghold. Therefore, it was called the city of David. And he built the city all around from the Milo in complete circuit, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can grab a seat. So let me give you a little bit of context for that. We are in a year-long series that we are calling Something to Say, and we're looking at the fact that God exists, and he exists on the macro level, the micro level. He created all things, but he's very intimate. He works in our lives. He works in individuals' lives. He didn't just create the world, throw it out there and say, "I wonder what Josh is going to do today." Right? I wonder what Sierra is going to do today. I wonder what Rich and Carolyn are doing next week. No. God intimately knows what's going on. God is kind. He is gracious. He is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, this passage that we looked at a lot last year. And he's actively working in our lives, and we have something to say about that. And so it's my hope that you love Jesus and you have something to say. And if you're not there yet, right, if you're not sure what you believe about Jesus, it's my hope that, like Sierra just showed, that you would investigate it and try to figure out who Jesus is. So at some point you would know him, and you too would have something to say. We're trying to look at a different person every single week of what their story is and how God's working in all of our lives, because he is, if we know and follow him. We're going to hear different stories, but as we're hearing different stories of people in our church, we're also looking at stories from thousands of years ago, how God has worked and how he continues to work. And in that, we've been in the life of David, who's said to be Israel's greatest king. We're 5 weeks in. Today, something significant happens that we've been waiting for since day one. Today, David finally becomes the king that we have been waiting for. He finally becomes the king after years of waiting, right? You remember the whole waiting game, and some of us are in that game. God, through the prophet Samuel, goes to David and he says, you're going to be king someday. He anoints him, and then he sends him back to the pasture. And man, we talked about how frustrating it is to be in the pasture sometimes, right? How frustrating it is to have something that you know to be true about yourself, about who God is, yet to not feel it. Right? For David, he knew it was true that he was going to be king. But for something like 20 years, he wasn't king. And we know what that's like to go through those seasons. To go through those seasons of, God, I thought you were doing something in my life, and now it seems like you're not doing much. Right? Those seasons where you're wondering, God, do you even see me? God, you claim to love me, yet for years it seems like you're not doing much in my life. We talked about how in those seasons of waiting, God does his best work. Because you think about this, God did not have to tell David ahead of time that he was going to be king. You ever think about that? Sometimes I think about right after Saul dies, God could have just in that moment said, okay, David, now you're going to be the king. But God knew what he was doing in telling him 20 years ahead of time. He knew that all those years, whether it was in fighting Goliath, in running from Saul, all those years, God was shaping his heart to say, do you trust me, David? Do you trust me that I'm going to hold on to you? Do you trust me that what I say is going to happen? Do you believe me? Will you follow me? And all of those years of waiting shape who he was as king. Man, if you're here and you feel like you're in a season of waiting, I would just encourage you, like David, keep waiting. Right? Keep waiting. That last verse in Psalm 27 that Jackie read up here talked about waiting for the Lord. In the waiting, God does some of his best work. But today, finally, David becomes king after 20 years. And it's an interesting thing. If you pay close attention to the story of David, he doesn't actually become full king the first time he becomes king, which is kind of confusing. 2 Samuel 2, he becomes kind of partial king. At this point, this nation was kind of divided in the north and the south. Again, it's confusing because the whole thing's called Israel, but the south was called Judah, the north is called Israel, and David becomes king of the southern region alone first. After Saul dies, his son Ishbosheth, he becomes king of the north, and for 7.5 more years, David's just half king. Again, more season of waiting. More season of wondering. God, I thought you had clarity when you said I was going to be king. Am I the full king? Am I half king? But for 7.5 more years, David is faithful in what God brought to him. And eventually what we read today is now the north comes to him and they say, okay, we are going to unite and we are going to be one kingdom under you, David. You will be our full king. Ultimately, David is king for 30 years. We don't know exactly where those 7.5 years fit in. Are they part of that? Are they before it? We're not totally sure. I think it's probably part of it. But here's this moment where David becomes the full king. As he becomes full king, we know a lot about David. We talked about this in week 1. We talked about the fact that he was different because he had a heart after God. Paul, the writer of a lot of the New Testament, he had this to say in Acts chapter 13, summarizing God's heart for David. Just listen to these words in Acts 13, verse 21. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart. Listen to this next part, who will do all my will. We think about David and we think about us following kind of his story in his life, and there's something that I think is so important in learning about David is that he had a heart after God. He didn't have God's heart. He had a heart after God. And I want that to settle in. For you and I, it does not matter the heart that we have today. It matters the heart that we're after. and we're after the heart of God. We want to be a people who ultimately are chasing what God chases. And yes, if you're in the nuance of language, that will give us the heart of God. But what we want to be is a people who are after God's heart, like David was after his heart. Today, we're going to see in crystal clarity, once he becomes king, what does it look like to be after the heart of God? What does it mean to be a person who seeks God's will, who seeks to be obedient to God? Ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to look at three things that David does in having a heart after God. But as we start that, I just want us to think, what are we after? Right? We all came in here this morning, and we're after different things. Right? What are we after? If I was to sit down with you, if I was to have one of those pastor conversations, and we're in my office, and we're drinking a cup of coffee, and you're just sitting across the table, and I say, what do you want? What is your heart after? Are you after a relationship? Are you after a job? Are you after status? Are you after comfort? Are you after excitement? Are you after something new? What do you want? To have a heart after God is to say, what I want is I want to know God. That's the one thing I want. I want to know God. Right? And ultimately, that's our hope here. Right? That's why we gather every week. We don't gather just because there's nice music and potentially some good friends, some decent nachos. Like that's not why we gather. Right? We gather because we want to know the heart of God. That's the only reason why we gather. We gather to please the Lord. We gather to worship Him, which is why we start in song every week. You notice we don't give an apologetic every week as why we start with singing. We gather every week and we start with singing because God's worth it. And we want to bend our hearts towards being after God, which is what David was famous for. He said this in Psalm 27, which Jackie read earlier, "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek Him in His temple." And that's what we're after. So what is David after when he becomes full king? We're going to look at three things. Two of them I'm just going to briefly mention. We're going to spend the vast majority of our time on the last thing that David does once he becomes full king. And you'll notice again, if you're paying close attention, especially when you read this week, that I'm skipping over kind of an interesting detail in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And I promise you that will be a vast majority of what we will talk about next week. Lord willing, we come back after Thanksgiving. But we got three things real quick, two real quick, one not so quick, that David is after. If you're a note taker, I got some. Oh, it's already up there. Oh, no, it's on the back. Just joking. First point, here we go. David doesn't run alone. Here we go, 1 Chronicles 11, starting in verse 10. This is after what we just read. "Now, these are the heads of the mighty men of whom David had, who remained faithful to him in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king in accordance with the word of the Lord concerning Israel." Immediately after David becomes king, the writer of Chronicles, who I believe is Ezra, he summarizes David's life and he talks about the men who were with David. He goes on for 2 chapters describing in great detail what it was like to have a group of people that David did life with. And we talk about this all the time around here. The Christian life was never meant to live alone. Right? We say it all the time. We need people. We got to have people who know us. We got to have people in our life who we can be honest with. And let's be honest, that's scary. It's hard to be vulnerable. It's hard to say, hey, here's what I'm really going through. Here's the mess on the deep inside. But we need that. See, Satan isolates. That's his whole goal, is isolation. He did it in the garden when he isolated Adam and Eve from God, and he does it from us with each other, where he gives us this idea that we have to have this false kind of preview to the world of who we think we ought to be, when God says, no, I bring you together. I give you one another, and that's the Christian life, that we are to have people in our lives that we love, that know us deeply, that we can share with. And so the invitation from David that we see immediately is he's not king alone. You think about who's in your life. You know, there's a lot of different ways to get people in your life. Community groups is one of many. Another way is simply just striking up conversation with someone and taking that conversation to the next level. Not just like, hey, how's your Sunday? We got 30 seconds till the pastor starts talking. Let's have some small talk. Go Beavs. Man, tough game last night. You know, you get some people all excited about the Ducks, whatever. But you might say like, hey, like, would you want to grab lunch at some point? Like, you might say like, hey, we've been doing this check-in for a couple months now because we kind of sit in the same seat. Hey, could I text you this week? Like, how could I pray for you? Like, that's a simple thing that takes things to the next level. But we see very quickly that David does not run alone. The next thing we quickly see is David fights his enemies. Immediately after he's anointed king, depending upon whether you're reading Chronicles or Samuel, very quickly after he goes to war against the Philistines. And we notice quickly as he goes to war, he defeats them and he defeats their idols. Listen to this. This is chapter 5 now of 2 Samuel, starting in verse 21. The Philistines left their idols there after being defeated, and David and his men carried them away. He recognizes that he has enemies, and he recognizes that he needs to fight against idolatry. See, for us, like, idolatry is hidden, right? But we all have idols. See, here's the deal. I just went to India, and there's idols everywhere. I just got back last week. Everywhere, like in many houses, you go to any natural place of beauty, like you go out in the middle of nowhere and there's this beautiful river, and then there's going to be a bunch of idols like on a bunch of rocks near the beautiful river, and people are worshiping them. And we think that's weird. How would people do that? But here's what we do. We go to that same beautiful river and we take the perfect curated selfie and we send it out to the world and we say, would you validate my idolatry? Right? Like my idolatry of how I want to look and how I want to be perceived, because I want to be perceived as someone who is adventurous and exciting. I am not a boring person, guys. I don't just go to Winco and Walmart. I'm awesome. I'm unique. Right? Validate that in me. Right? We have idols. And David conquers his idols first thing. He says, hey, what am I up against? I recognize that there's an enemy out there. Right? We all have them. They all look a little bit different depending upon who we are, right? Some of us may walk in here and our idol may be like, I just need to succeed, right? Some of us may walk in here and like, I just want to feel accepted. I just want to look good, right? I just want, some of us, let's be honest, as we're getting ready for Thanksgiving, we might have this idol that says, if my kids and my parents and my grandparents, if we could just have a great little Thanksgiving weekend, my life will be complete. Maybe that's an idol. Right? We all have them. David recognizes it, and he fights that first. Lastly, and this is where I'm going to spend a vast majority of my time, the third thing David does is he seeks the presence of God. Listen to this in 2 Samuel 6, verse 1. And I'll be honest, the presence of God can be both terrifying and beautiful. And we're going to see this here in a minute. Here we go. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. He grabs 30,000 men. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. David wanted one thing. He makes a huge effort to seek the presence of God. And in that day, 3,000 years ago, to seek the presence of God was to seek the Ark of the Covenant. Now, small minor note, last night for the first time, I did watch Indiana Jones, Treasures of the Lost Ark, something like that. Raiders of the Lost Ark. I was castigated in prayer this morning for telling people that I had not watched that until now, but it really helped me in my late study of figuring out what David must have been doing. I think there's some parallels. I don't know. So if you're like, what is he talking about? Let me explain. Prior to David, you go all the way back to when Israel was enslaved to the Egyptians. They're enslaved for 400 years, and God brings them out of slavery for one reason. He says, I want to dwell with you. Right? You remember when Moses was talking to Pharaoh, let my people go so that. There's a reason. It's not just so that they can go do whatever they want. Let my people go so that I can be with them. Right? And God's unique season of being with people meant this. He would dwell with them in a tabernacle, ultimately in a box, which sounds super weird. I get it. The Ark of the Covenant, right? In this Ark were the 10 Commandments, and in this Ark, God says, I'm going to give you my special presence. He gives this instruction in Exodus chapter 25, and at the very end of Exodus, the very last chapter, God's holy presence dwells in a very profound, very unique way in the Ark of the Covenant. And where the Ark was, God's presence was. You wanted to be near the Lord, you were near the Ark. And so this happened for centuries, right? Only something happened. When David became king, the Ark was nowhere to be found. Saul did not seek the presence of God. We know this is true because 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 3 says, we did not seek it in the days of Saul. They didn't have the presence of God in that profound way when Saul was king. The ark was nowhere to be found. See, prior to Saul becoming king, here's what happens. Israel goes to war with the Philistines. They're constantly battling the Philistines. They go to war with the Philistines, and in this battle, the Philistines win. And they take the Ark of the Covenant, and they think, oh, this is awesome. I've heard great things about your God. I heard that he freed you out of Egypt. I heard that he did all these plagues. I want this God of yours because maybe he will, help me out some way. So they take the Ark of the Covenant, they take it back to their camp, and they put it in one of their pagan temples to a god that they have named Dagon. They put it in this temple, and the next day, Dagon, this idol, is fallen flat on his face, and they're going, how did that happen? They raise him back up. The next day, they wake up, Dagon's head and his hands are gone, and he's fallen over again. And so they're like, okay, this is a problem. Not only was that happening, but the whole camp breaks out in tumors and boils, and people start dying. Like, well, maybe this lucky rabbit foot God box that we have isn't actually great for us. So what do? They send it to another Philistine camp. Well, the same thing happens in that camp. Right? People start breaking out in tumors and boils. People start dying. They're like, no, let's not try this again. So they send it to another Philistine camp. Right? This goes on for 7 months. After 7 months, they kind of come around to it, and they're like, well, this box is with us. We're all dying. We're breaking out in all kinds of hives and boils. We don't want anything to do with this. So what do? They make a cart with wheels. They attach it to 2 oxen. They put all these sacrifices on it, these like atonements for their sins, and they're like, we're going to send you away. You go back to Israel, but we're not going with you, oxen. You're just going to have to figure it out on your own. So they crack the whip, and the oxen take off. Like, hopefully that goes somewhere good. And it takes off, and it makes its way to Israel. Like God's saying, okay, I'm going to take you home. So it goes back to Israel, and the people receive this cart with the Ark of the Covenant, and everyone's all excited. God's with us again. But God being with us again was something like, oh, God can help me with what I want. Maybe we'll have victory again. Maybe this will be for me. And they meet God on their terms, not his terms, and they do what they knew they were not supposed to do. They open the Ark of the Covenant, and their faces melted off. Just joking. That was from the movie. Their faces didn't melt off. But it could have. The Bible doesn't say that didn't happen. Follow me. 70 people die instantly. That's in the Bible. Right? And it's terrifying to the Israelites. It's terrifying. Listen to this. 1 Samuel 6, verse 20. This is their response. Who is able to stand before the Lord? This holy God. They're terrified of the holiness of God. God kills 70 of them on the spot for doing what they knew they ought not to do. See, here's the thing. We don't get to meet God on our terms. We got to meet him on his terms. God is not some pet outside that we get to bring in whenever we want. They're like, hey, come play with us, and then when we don't want you, we'll let you go. That's not how God works. And so the Israelites send God outside the camp again for 20 years. For 20 years. And as Saul is reigning, we don't know exactly what happens. There's a lot of mystery in this. We know at one point there's one verse where Saul does bring the ark. I think it's in 1 Chronicles 14, I think. 1 Samuel 14. He brings it to war as, again, some sort of good luck charm, but by and large, he does not seek the presence of God. We read that in 1 Chronicles 13. He did not seek the ark in the days of Saul, but now David becomes king. And he goes, I need something. I need the presence of God. If I'm going to lead this people the way that God wants me to, I need his presence here. And so he takes 30,000 people, and he goes and follow along the story. It's pretty wild. Here's what's happened. Some of you guys know this story. David goes to the ark, and he treats it like the Philistines do. He treats the presence of God like the Philistines did, as some sort of good luck charm. And he too makes a cart. And he too attaches it to 2 oxen. And he's on his way to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. And something happens. One of the oxen stumbles, and the ark's about to fall and hit the ground. And a guy named Uzzah reaches out to keep the ark from falling and hitting the ground. And God kills him on the spot. Now, you and I hate that story. I do not like that. Like everything in my American individualistic, like the God who I think that I want, I don't like that story, and here's why. I know God has rules, but I'd like to think that human life's more important. Right? I know he has rules, but I'd like to think that there are exceptions to the rules. Right? It wouldn't, like, the guy's trying to keep God from hitting the ground on a box. Why would you kill him? And you know who else feels that way? David. David's furious, and he's terrified. And he's like, wait, I knew how I was supposed to carry the Lord. David was the king of Israel. He personally had to handwrite the first 5 books of the Bible. He knows the instructions that God gave to Moses on how you're supposed to move the ark. It's not supposed to be on a cart. It's only supposed to be carried by the Levites. But David thinks, I'm just going to do it my way. And God says, no, you don't get to do religion your way. You don't get to seek me on your terms. You get to seek me on my terms. We see this in 2 Samuel 6:8, and David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah. And David was afraid of the Lord of hosts that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? Again, we don't like that story either. We like to think that God will meet us on our terms. And God's saying, no. Like, I don't meet you on your terms. You meet me on my terms. And so David leaves. Can you believe it? David leaves the Ark of the Covenant. And he leaves it to someone who's not even Israelite. He leaves it to a Gittite, a guy named Obed-Edom. He's like, you know what? Like, I don't want, like, this is a problem. I don't like how God's operating here, so I'm going to leave God at arm's length. You ever been there before? Like, I don't like what I'm reading in this text about how I'm supposed to live. I don't like the exclusivity of Christianity. It seems like God ought to love everyone. Right? It seems like, can't God, like, save the whole world? I mean, I was just in India, and I met a lot of really nice Hindus who don't necessarily love Jesus. Why can't you just save all them? And sometimes it's easy to kind of keep God at arm's length and say, I like you, God, I'm going to try to follow you, but I don't necessarily love all of the things you say. And God is really exclusive. He says, there's one way to know me, and that's through Jesus. There's only one way, but in his exclusivity, he's insanely inclusive, because through Jesus, everyone is welcome. But it's only through Jesus. And again, that rubs us the wrong way sometimes. And so David leaves the ark, and when we leave the presence of God, we miss out on the blessing of God, because listen to what happens next. Obed-Edom, some random outsider, he starts getting blessed, right? Right? For 3 months, the text says, I'm going to read the text, it's somewhere in my notes. For 3 months, here we go. This is 2 Samuel 6:11. We don't know exactly what it means, but it just says, God blessed the household of Obed-Edom in all that he had. So much so that David hears about it 3 months later, and he's going, oh man, I made a major mistake. Like, I should not have kept the Lord out here. I should have changed the way that I approached him, and I knew that what I was doing was wrong. I should have approached him the way that God asked me to approach him. And notice what happens next. This is 1 Chronicles 15. Starting in verse 2, then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God. He goes and he gets it. For the Lord had chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. And David assembled all Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place where he had prepared for it. And David gathered together the sons of Aaron and the Levites. Verse 11. Then David summoned the priests, verse 12, and said to them, "You are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, you and your brothers, so that you may bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place that I have prepared for it. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us." And listen to this is so profound. "Because we did not seek him according to the rule. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord." Verse 25, "So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing." Just side note for those of you who are really into it, take a deep dive into Obed-Edom, because what happens with Obed-Edom, he's an outsider, he's a Gittite. He actually comes to Jerusalem and he becomes one of the Levites later on. He becomes one of the gatekeepers of the temple. We read that in Chronicles. Verse 26, "And because God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. David was clothed with the robe of fine linen, as also were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and the singers, and the Chaniah, and the leaders of the music of the singers. And David wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, to the sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, and made loud music on harps and lyres." To have a heart after God is to meet God on his terms. And that's hard. And that's beautiful, and it's right, and it's good. I'm going to pray into this. I'm going to bring the band up, but I want us to pray for just a minute here. Would you just bow your heads and pray with me while the band comes up? God, I thank you for this story, and I want to just sit before you with my friends here, and I want to say, God, where am I trying to meet you on my terms? God, where do I want to hold you at arm's length and say, I like this about you, but I want this to be different? God, when we do that, one of two things happens. Either one, it's terrifying because we will experience your righteous holiness, and ultimately that will come to fruition in the right judgment of all things. And two, we miss out on being with you, and we miss out on your blessing. And God, we want to be a church that meets you where you are, because you're the God of the universe. I'm not. God, you're the God who says, this is how I am to be met. And in David's day, it was discouraging and it was frustrating to David when things didn't go his way. And in my day, it feels the same way. God, when I read Scripture and I think, man, this seems a little harsh, or man, I don't necessarily want to do it this way. That's my heart saying, I want to make the rules. And you say, no, I make the rules. And God, we recognize that as you make the rules, you make them all right and good, and you see what I don't. I pray that we'd be a people who seek you on your terms, that we would have a heart after you, that wants one thing, that wants your presence, not me. We love you, Jesus. It's in your beautiful name we pray, amen. Love you guys.
Thanks for listening to today's teaching from Northwest Hills Community Church. We hope you find ways to apply the gospel to your life. And be sure to check out our website, nwhills.com, where you'll find ways to engage with us. And if you're able, we'd love to see you at church next Sunday. Thanks again for listening.